We'll obviously get onto your incredible TV CV in a bit, but I find it fascinating to learn about people's early interactions with TV. When I was young, I wanted to be Bruce Forsyth, but I know that other people knew from a very early age what they wanted to do. So, with this in mind, who were your TV heroes?
Well, I mean, I had a range of them, I suppose. Like a lot of people of my age, there were only three channels. So I guess stars burnt a bit brighter in those days. You know, if you were watching the great TV shows of Saturday evening, Basil Brush, Generation Game, Doctor Who, and then in the week, Blue Peter, Vision On, Animal Magic, you know, the people who presented those shows really stood out. They were like, I think they had more impact in a way now in a very crowded world that we are in now. I did love Blue Peter. I mean, I watched that like millions of others pretty faithfully. I won a badge when I was just 5 years old. Of course, I stupidly took it to school. My mum said, "Don't take that to school. You'll only lose it." And of course, she was right. It didn't come back, and I was a bit heartbroken. But I do remember that when I was 16 and I should have been revising for my mock O levels as they were then, I used to skive off and watch kids' TV in the afternoon. And Blue Peter showed a film, behind the scenes film about the making of the program. And by 16, I was too old for it really, but you know, there wasn't anything else on. Anyway, I watched it and I just thought, what an amazing job it would be to work on this show. And I think, you know, pretty much from that point on, I had my sights set on where I eventually ended up working. You know, it was really important when I just happened to catch that film, and it really made me fall in love with the idea of working in TV.
As we know, the BBC is forever fighting against external forces about its place in modern society. Beyond the obvious political debate surrounding the licence fee, how significant is the corporation to British life as we know it?
Oh, I think it's impossible to underestimate the significance of the BBC in our culture. I mean, even people who hate on the BBC, you know, it's so unique. I've been very lucky to travel quite a lot abroad, and it's when you realize that there's nothing like it anywhere else in the world. And not only that, when you meet people in America or Russia or South America, wherever it is, they're so in awe of the BBC. You know, to them, it represents standards that they just don't have access to in their countries. And I think, you know, there's plenty wrong with the BBC. If you stop at any point in its history, there's always stuff that isn't working or needs looking at or whatever. But overall, I think it's a force for good. And I think that when it works best in two ways. One is in bringing people together. So whether it's the funeral of Her Majesty the Queen, or whether it's Wimbledon final, or whether it's, you know, Doctor Who coming back and amazingly getting 13 million viewers, those moments where it brings people together. But also, I think the other thing it stands for is reflecting British people's lives and experiences, holding up a mirror to our lives. So in those two ways, I think it's unique and it's priceless.
Mm. Throughout history, Blue Peter has remained a trusted rite of passage for both broadcasters and production crews to nurture new talent. When we spoke to the great Anthea Turner, she described Blue Peter as the university of television. In your opinion, how did legendary figures like Biddy Baxter help to cultivate the footprint for the modern TV presenter?
Well, I think in terms of presenters, the great thing about Blue Peter, Anthony is quite right. And what she means by that is that on Blue Peter, you aren't presenting, you know, one type of thing. You're required to be able to do everything from an interview to demonstrating sport and action things, to traveling, dealing with different cultures, making things, gardening, being able to relate to children, being able to also talk to someone who survived Colditz or was the last survivor of the Titanic disaster or whatever it was. So the range of different things that you have to be able to do as a good Blue Peter presenter, there's nothing like it. And the presenters that I know that I'm friends with who are now working in other areas of TV, it's given them such an incredible foundation and grounding. They can sort of do anything really. Biddy, where Biddy was brilliant, I think, and set the standard, was that she wasn't interested in a kind of slick, you know, kind of turn it on like a tap presenter. She wanted people with real personalities so that she could train them, she could make them, shape them into becoming a Blue Peter presenter to do what they needed to do. But if they didn't have a personality, if they didn't have something interesting about them, it wasn't worth doing that. So that meant she experimented, and sometimes it didn't work. But when it did work with like a John Noakes or an Yvette Fielding or people who became very popular, a lot of that was to do with the fact that she realized, you know, you had to have an interesting person before you could turn them into a TV presenter.
Hmm. Josh said he remembers the Tracy Island episode, which he tried to make himself. It was a yeah. It was things like that.
You
Make
need a
every
degree in mechanical engineering to make that, I think.
yeah. um. So leaving Blue Peter in 2007, you turned your hand to documentary making when you created the fascinating Who Peter, Partners in Time, exploring the many links between Doctor Who and Blue Peter. We've been lucky enough to speak to quite a few legends of Blue Peter, and they've all said that a background in theatre and drama helped them to nurture their role on the show. However, what conclusions were you able to draw about the relationship between those two iconic shows?
I think that Blue Peter and Doctor Who were part of the family of the BBC. So there were certain shows. I mean, I would also include things like Saturday morning TV, nowadays the One Show, you know, shows that run a very long time, and they have links in that a lot of the time the crews will have worked on both shows. So you'll find that camera crews that worked on Doctor Who will also work on Blue Peter. Studios were shared. I remember when Elizabeth Sladen came on to Blue Peter when I was there to promote the Sarah Jane Adventures, and she was looking around her and saying, "This is the studio we used to do a lot of Doctor Who in." So she kind of felt weirdly at home, even though it was decades later. And also, of course, I mean, what is interesting is that some of the presenters of Blue Peter appeared in Doctor Who. In Peter Purvis's case, he was a companion. Janet Ellis was a guest artist. So I think there were sort of all those blurrings of the lines. And the other thing was that Biddy Baxter, right at the beginning of Doctor Who, realized that although it wasn't made by the children's department, it was made by drama. Obviously, it was all a massive hit with children. And that meant that it made total sense to feature Doctor Who on Blue Peter. And that's why it popped up so often, because it was box office. And if it was showing you how to make a, you know, a Doctor Who toy theatre, in my time, we made a Dalek pen. You know, you could put your pens and pencils into this Dalek pen pot holder. And they were so clever. And, you know, kids loved that. You know, it was kind of a win-win for everybody.
Mm. Just said when we spoke to Sarah Green, she said the reason she got the gig on Blue Peter was because she'd been on as a guest to promote a drama that she was doing the rounds with.
That's absolutely right. She'd been in The Swish of the Curtain, a Sunday classic serial. And I think that Biddy saw her sitting on the seat unit, chatting away, and thought she was so natural and so likable that they kind of waited till the show finished. And then she said, "Darling, would you like to audition?" I think she auditioned a couple of weeks later and was on the show within a month of that appearance. So that was a kind of life-changing fluke that Sarah experienced. But you see, there you go. Biddy had a strong gut instinct, and boy, was she right about Sarah Green.
Mm. Top of the Pops was another juggernaut of a show that you were involved in. In your opinion, how did the landscape of TV Centre benefit the magic of the show?
Top of the Pops was a fixture, obviously, for so many, many years. That what was great about it was that really it could adapt to anything. So you could have your one-hit wonders, you could have your incredibly credible up-and-coming indie bands, you could have a big American artist, you could have the Wombles, you know. I mean, literally, as long as you were in the charts, as long as your record was selling. But the machinery of Top of the Pops, the way it operated, it was so slick and so clever that, you know, you created this kind of fake nightclub effect in a studio. The studio was always smaller than people thought it would be because of the angles of the cameras and the way the sets were designed. And it was an incredibly efficient machine. You know, you would rehearse, each band would get about a half an hour camera rehearsal. There was quite a long lunch break. And I have to say, in my day, and certainly before, a lot of the crew would go up to the BBC bar where there was a subsidized bar. Those were the days. And the afternoon, people would be a bit more shaky on the cameras because they'd have been drinking a bit. It never seemed to upset things too. And then when we did the show, it was either live or as live. So I think that it had an adrenaline and an excitement. And people liked to do it, whether it was working on the crew, whether it was appearing on the show. And obviously some bands who came back again and again and again were sort of part of the furniture, and their entourage, the record company people who came with them. That I can give you a good example. When I was working on Top of the Pops, Nikki Chapman, who is now a presenter on things like Escape to the Country and on Radio 2, she was a record company person, and she'd come in with different bands, the Spice Girls, whatever, and she was lovely. And so it was very interesting to me that she then made that jump from being behind the scenes to being a presenter.
It always acted as a barometer for capturing the fashions of pop music. So why do you think it lost its power to engage with the youth demographic in the 21st century?
Well, I think two things happened. One thing is I think it was cancelled way sooner than it needed to be, because I'm afraid one of the truths of the BBC is it kills its own. It did it with Doctor Who, it did it with Saturday Mornings. To some extent, it happened with Blue Peter, and it certainly happened with Top of the Pops. The problem with long-running shows is that when the next lot of people come along, very often the high-ups, the execs, the management think, well, I've got this warhorse of a show. It takes a lot of effort to keep long-running shows fresh and to keep them evolving without spoiling them. It's a lot of hard work, but they very rarely get much attention. So you're not going to win BAFTAs. You're not going to get a great round of applause for a show that's been running for 20 years. You do that with new stuff. So what would happen is you get executives coming in and they look at how much Top of the Pops cost in a year, and they think, well, if we didn't do that, we'd have X many million to spend on our own projects. And that definitely happened. They did what I call death by scheduling, where they start to move a show around the schedules, and then they can say, oh, the audience couldn't find it. And you thought, well, of course they couldn't, because you kept switching the day and the time. But the other thing that happened with Top of the Pops, I do think it would have struggled eventually, apart from the BBC being lukewarm about it and kind of wanting to see the back of it. The issue was that the world was changing with the arrival of the internet, with YouTube, with Spotify. The democratization of music meant that charts were no longer the be all and end all. And also, if you talk to young people now, if you talk to kids, they have access to every genre, every era. That means that they don't get sort of slavishly fixated on the top 30. That's a really kind of dated analog concept. So then it would have been hard for Top of the Pops, given the title, to really find the measure of how you feature that. The one thing I'd say in conclusion, which I think is sad, is that the archive of Top of the Pops, where it exists, is second to none. And we don't really have something comparable. So we've got, you know, later with Jules Holland or whatever, but that's not the same really. And you don't, so the BBC have not really been keeping up with building up that archive of reflecting the most popular bands and artists of the time. And that's, I think, a real pity.
Hmm.
I'm fine. Yeah.
Josh said, is it true that Simon Cowell tried to buy it?
I don't know the answer to that. It wouldn't surprise me. And in a way, that's sort of what you need. I mean, I'm a great believer that if a great brand exists, usually it can be reinvented because there's a deep affection for shows like that. Doctor Who is the evidence of that. Many years people said, oh, Doctor Who's been done, it can't be revived. And then Russell T Davies came along, and here we are, however many years since he brought it back. I kind of think a good idea is a good idea. It's how you do it. It's how you nowadays market it, because people need to know it's happening. And Simon Cowell would, of course, been very good at the marketing. So yeah, I don't know if that's true, but I can see why. I think there's still a magazine. I'm not sure if that's still going, but I think there's still Top of the Pops magazine. There's something about the brand, and I know that the repeats on BBC Four are about their highest watched content. So there's definitely an appetite for that kind of show.
On the 16th of July 2012, the BBC agreed to sell Television Centre to Stanhope for £200 million. What was your initial reaction to this? And in your opinion, how could we make our political system better in order to change the way governments support the arts?
That's a massive question. That's two questions, and the second bit's a very big one, but I'll do my best. I mean, I was not. I'm afraid I just thought the sale of Television Centre was entirely due to politics and nothing to do with value for money for the British licence fee payer. And I just thought it was insane, and I still think it's insane. They came up with a lot of guff about, oh, the building's aging and it needs updating. Well, so what? Update it. That would have been a lot cheaper than having to up sticks. And I mean, I think they were in a no-win situation, the BBC, because the government was basically saying, if you don't relocate a lot of people to Salford to help us, the government, regenerate Salford, then you're going to be in trouble when it comes to the next license fee deal. As it turned out, they were in trouble with that anyway, but that's politicians for you. Don't trust a politician. But anyway, the sale, which was, I think, a risible amount of money, I thought it was an inept transaction. It did. I mean, then people would say, "Oh, there's still 3 studios at TV Centre now," but it's that thing about the price of everything and the value of nothing. And then I think that tips into the second part of your question, which is the problem with funding for the arts in this country is that very often politicians don't see or willfully blind themselves the correlation between investing in things that don't give you an immediate profit or return, but maybe 5, 10, 15 years down the line they do, because the bums on seats you get, whether it's in theatre, whether it's in sales of TV shows, whether it's in championing the kind of creative talent that comes up through publishing, like a J.K. Rowling or, a Val McDermid or whoever it is. I mean, that's a long game. The other thing, of course, which has to be said, is the reason that a lot of politicians don't like the arts is because it's the arts that foster the sort of awkward, uncomfortable people who ask questions about the way the government is run and who will do shows that attack the system, and they would quite like to get rid of all of that. They would be very happy if there was no "Have I got news for you," no news night, no analysis, and if it was all like Fox News in the States, where you can't really believe what you see. I think it's got a lot tougher as well because we've had a very long period where in what I call the age of stupid, where people just simply don't value. It's even a community thing. So, funding for local theatres and things, which has been cut. Inevitably, that means local people lose jobs. People don't get the chance to see things on their doorstep. It's like dominoes, that it's all linked together. And one can only hope that more intelligent people will come along and see that there is real value in funding the arts.
That closure did, however, lead to the creation of a feature-length documentary, The Tales of Television Centre, in 2012. In the area when the corporation constantly fights against criticism of appearing too self-absorbed, how important was it to find angles that would endear a neutral audience towards it?
Well, I think that's a very valid point, that you don't want to be self-indulgent. I mean, throughout the making of Tales of Television Centre, and I think this applies to any sort of retrospective documentary that you make. Same if you were doing it about an artist or a venue. I think you've got to think, well, what do people want to see? What's going to entertain them? You don't want to put too much of an agenda in place. I mean, although I've told you I didn't agree with the selling of Television Centre, it wasn't for me to turn that into a kind of party political broadcast. It was a celebration of what that building meant. And it sounds silly in a way to say celebrating a building and what does a building mean? But actually been the backdrop of so many shows that millions and millions of people had bought into and loved, that once we started to look at it, we had way too much material. And it was the only program I've ever worked on in any capacity where everybody, bar about 2 or 3 people, like literally scores of people, we asked them and they all said yes, it would be my honor to pay tribute to Television Centre. So Terry Wogan, David Frost, Nigel Havers, Penelope Keith, whoever it was said yes. And so we were kind of faced with this problem, although it was 90 minutes long, how are we going to try and fit? And we didn't, when some people didn't make it into the final cut. But I'm glad to say the BBC archive preserved, or as far as I know, they preserved all the rushes for posterity.
Mm.
Yeah.
Josh said last year we did a season on Television Centre itself, and we couldn't believe how many people came back and said yes. People that had previously turned down interviews for the podcast were happy to send in however they could thoughts of remembering the Television Centre or sort of little anecdotes here and there, and it was quite eye opening to see the sort of respect it has within the industry, I think.
Absolutely, there you go. I mean, for so many people, it was there. I mean, Anthea talked about the University of Television, and for a long time, that university was based at Television Centre, and they were all the graduates,
Mm. At that time, the corporation was in the process of moving out of TV Centre, and you were able to capture some of the process on camera. In what ways did that offer the documentary more gravitas, and were you able to keep any sentimental items?
It was very atmospheric. I mean, I found it sometimes very melancholic because Television Centre had been my playground for years, professionally and personally. And it meant a lot to me. And I knew that even though they were sort of going to keep a bit of it, it would be nothing like the place that it had been. I could talk you through all the different bits of it. I knew that from the basement up to the top floor to the roof, East Tower, the design block, the restaurant block. I knew all those places really well, all the kind of nooks and crannies, and I knew all that would get swept away. So during the months we had to make that program, as more and more of it shut down and closed up, I did sometimes feel really quite sad. And I'd kind of wander around, and you do that thing of thinking, this is maybe the last time I'll ever be in this room. And, sometimes we took photos and all the rest of it. But I also wanted to kind of get that sense in the documentary so that there were shots of that you were framing pictures of the areas that the public wouldn't normally see, but to give them a sense of the scale of the place and all these kind of different little bits of it that you wouldn't normally see on camera. In terms of souvenirs or things that I took with me, I didn't really, I mean, other people did. There was a big party that I went to that lots of former members of staff went, and I think a couple of people got into trouble for sort of unscrewing signs. I mean, I would have quite liked one of those in this font, one of those signs, or one of the kind of notice boards that you saw as you walk into a studio. But then I think, well, I've got a fair amount of souvenirs from my own career, and to some extent, I've learned that things live on in your heart and your head, and that's where they really belong. And that the physical memories, they're less important. They're nice to have. It's nice to have that.
Yeah. Obviously, it was an emotional time, but a lot of the sort of faces you spoke to were synonymous with the building. Were there any particularly emotional accounts that you observed when you were making it?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just off the top of my head, Barry Norman got quite nearly overcome with the fact that he just kept saying, I was so happy here. Susan Hampshire, who'd starred in so many dramas made at TV Centre, uh, Terry Wogan, who was, you know, he was sort of ill, really ill at that point, and he made this huge effort to come in. And again, the place had meant a huge amount to him. David Frost, he died very shortly afterwards and really was quite frail, but he wanted to pay tribute to where his career had begun, where that was the week that was set light the whole British satire scene and launched him. And then, you know, Esther Ranson, you know, I remember her walking into the studio and kind of taking an intake of breath and thinking, I had so many experiences in this building. So
Mm.
yeah, I mean, they're just a few off the top of my head. Nobody came in. The only person who was a little bit like, why are we making a fuss about this building, was Jeremy Paxman. But that was really Jeremy Paxman's act. You know, that's what he did. He would always be the contrary person. In fact, he was charming and he gave us a really good interview. But he did say, you know, I don't really believe in all this atmosphere in the bricks and mortar. You know, I think it's just a place where stuff happened. And David Attenborough also, he said, what's more important than the building is the programs that came out of it. And I kind of thought, well, yes, that's true, but the building was the engine room of British television for so many years. And there's a lot of stuff that probably wouldn't have happened had there not been a building like TV Centre, because the way it was designed almost encouraged people to plot and plan and intrigue and to create, and it was a kind of fertile backdrop for all these things to happen.
Mm. So on Friday, the 22nd of March, 2013, BBC Television Centre closed its doors for the final time, and BBC decided to mark this with an all-star extravaganza in TC1. In your opinion, how did the success of Tales of Television Centre highlight that importance in making this marking the occasion?
Well, actually, it's quite a funny story because Tales of Television Centre was actually commissioned and paid for by the BBC's comedy department. And that kind of was slightly strange. They decided they wanted to make it. And the original premise that had been put together by a former colleague of mine, who we'd both been in studio management as assistant floor managers back in the day, and her name's Ali, and she'd come up with this idea, which was much more rooted around sketch comedy. It was meant to be you know, kind of written to feature people like French and Saunders doing sketches about TV Centre and stuff. And that was going to be kind of impossible to put together, really. And also, I didn't want to make that. I knew what I wanted to make. So we sort of thanked her, nodded in that direction by including some of the great comedy moments, because you sort of obviously do want to reflect that. But really, it was a documentary. And that really annoyed the BBC's kind of features and arts department, because they thought it was their province. And it's so BBC, you know, people think it's one big happy family, but you've got these different departments and they are all competitive, and they weren't happy. And so in fact, that final night, the program that they did was the arts department sort of saying, this is what we wanted to do. So they kind of got their go at it, which I thought was fine. And there was parts of it that I really loved, but it was less incisive, less emotional. And because they had Michael Grade involved, Michael Grade was an apologist for the sale of Television Centre. You know, he was coming out with all the rubbish about, you know, oh, it's not fit for purpose, because he was going to stand to gain, I guess, from the BBC getting rid of it and moving on. And maybe that was also his view. But the point was, it was a more partisan approach, I guess. But there you go. It was quite interesting. I think they had to have their consolation prize.
Mm. Looking at broadcasting as a whole, how significant is TV Centre in the story of British popular culture, and what is its legacy?
Oh, I think for the kind of creation and establishing of British television broadcasting, Television Centre is massively significant. I mean, hugely important. It's like saying, I don't know, Oxford or Cambridge as a kind of hotbed of learning and ideas, and the things that were tested and developed at TV Centre, from color television to early interactivity to all sorts of, there's just a lot of stuff. But of course the industry has changed, the world has changed, things are not done the same way. Drama is not made in studios in that way anymore. There's been a colossal shift in a lot of ways, so it kind of also belongs to an era. What you can't kind of go back in a way. Television Centre also belongs to the post-war generation, where they were feeling very hopeful. We'd won this war, this terrible war. There was still the Cold War going on, but there was a real feeling in Britain of optimism that we were kind of the new Elizabethans. So there was going to be this new society, and that's reflected in the architecture. I mean, a lot of it didn't work out. So, comprehensive schools, redevelopment of the centre of cities like Birmingham and the Bullring, concrete brutalist architecture. Television Centre is a classic example of that kind of era of architecture. And the idea that these are buildings for everybody, very democratic, it's going to kind of bring everyone together. I think society is in a very different place now, and not all of that stuff worked, but it is a shame that what we've lost is this kind of distillation of optimism and hope and expertise and excellence. Because one of the things that the industry's lost is somewhere where learning, like going back to Anthea, it wasn't just a university of television for presenters, it was a university of television for technicians, craftspeople. You could walk around there when I was learning to be a director, any problem you had, you could wander off somewhere, and in a tea bar you'd see, and I'm having to do this, I'm not sure how to, and there would be someone to advise you. And that's kind of all gone. And the training of the next generation, that's kind of left to them. They have to find their way. There aren't the same kind of formal means to bring people on and develop talent. So yeah, I mean, I think it was massively, massively important, but we are in a different era now.
Just that there was a lot of collaborations at the time, and a lot of those collaborations wouldn't have been possible if everyone weren't together.
Absolutely spot on. I mean, exactly that. And also the fact that because it was its own world within a world, people had the confidence to say, I mean, the great story about the Monty Python team going to the head of comedy and them just saying, yeah, sure, go and make 13 programs. I mean, that would never happen now. People are very scared, very cautious. There's less money. Things have to work straight away. So that environment in which creativity could flourish. And of course, there were plenty of turkeys and things that didn't work, but you also got amazing things that happened because of that environment where people could just say, yeah, we're going to do this, and we've got the facilities to do it, and we can do it next week.
Looking back at your career, what's your proudest achievement?
Oh, that's a hard one. I think I feel quite proud of having kept a career going for 35 plus years, because it is a tough industry. And that's not meant to be, boo-hoo, because I think anything worth doing is tough, whether it's the law, banking, journalism, whatever, career you choose to do. The stakes are usually high. I feel proud as probably of the fact that on Blue Peter, the kind of engagement we got with the audience. I've had letters since from people who grew up during the time I was there that are very humbling because of the impact it had on their lives, and in some cases really changed their lives. The program meant so much to them and inspired them. And I was always humbled by what kids would achieve through the Blue Peter appeal. I was very proud. We did a Blue Peter appeal for HIV/AIDS in Africa. And I was told by a lot of senior people at the BBC at the time that I shouldn't be contemplating such a subject because it was inappropriate for children. And I kind of knew that children, especially by the noughties, were living in a world where they might not know exactly what it was about, but they'd heard of HIV and AIDS, and it was a huge growing problem in Africa. And there was a really kind of clear policy that that UNICEF had. And we asked kids to collect shoes, and I can't remember the final figure, but it was getting on for 2 million pairs of shoes, which was an extraordinary thing to do. Again, at a time where people were saying, oh, you know, you don't bother with that anymore because the audiences are fragmenting. You know, when we did the Design a Monster competition in Doctor Who, which I'm also very proud of, that was in the summer, and we got nearly 50,000 entries. And it was amazing. And I love the fact that we were able to be that ambitious. So when we did things like that, it wasn't like you win a prize. It was you win a life-changing prize. Probably the greatest one I ran, and was my idea, was in the 300th anniversary of St. Petersburg. We did a competition with the grandson of Carl Fabergé of the Fabergé eggs. And the prize was to have your Fabergé egg made by this company. You would be flown to St. Petersburg. You would get to keep one version of the egg for yourself. And then you would also get to present the other one to the mayor of St. Petersburg in this wonderful golden Romanov palace. I mean, it was an extraordinary competition. And they were just a couple of the examples. So I think, you know, I'm very proud of what we did on behalf of children, the opportunities we were able to offer, and the fact that years later, I'm still encountering people who would say what that meant to them.
So the last question, what's next for Richard Marson?
A good question. Well, I think I've moved now more to writing. Television is really tough at the moment. I finished my last TV job to date. I mean, I haven't said that I've given up TV, but, you know, I finished my last job, what was it, 18 months ago. Then I went into the Biddy book, which took a long time to research and write. That came out last summer. Since then, I've been involved in 2 consultancies, which are where they pay you for your supposed wisdom. Hopefully you deliver. But, you know, you become, I guess, an expert advisor on formats and on shows that are being developed. And then I'm going to write another book, which I don't really want to talk about because you jinx it, but that's going to involve a lot of research too. So kind of more writing than anything else now. But yeah, related to TV. That's my love.
Well, yeah, we're going.
Josh said, Sarah Green said you'd be a fantastic interview, and she wasn't wrong. So,
oh, thank you. That's very kind of you, Josh. And yeah, I mean, that's great praise from coming from Greeno. She's a legend.
well, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. And
oh, absolute pleasure. It was lovely talking to you both. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. Josh will let you know when it goes out and everything like that. But we'll
lovely.
Yeah, hopefully we'll meet again, and we'll nice to catch up in the future. Yeah,
anytime.
Right. Take care.
Lovely to see you guys. Yeah, take care. Bye now, Josh. Bye.